Thank you for inviting me to come and speak. Today I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so on this. It's very much a pilot project at this stage, just to kind of introduce you to the aims of the project and some of the initial observations, if you like. Daily activities and resource use in Neolithic Orkney, microarchaeology at the Ness of Brodgar. Now, I'm sure this is a site that probably doesn't need too much introduction for most of you. It's located, obviously, up in Orkney, mainland Orkney, near to the town of Ness out here on the peninsula. It's part of the Ring of Brodgar World Heritage Site. And excavations have actually been going on there for quite a number of years, but have kind of gained momentum, if you like, quite recently due to a lot of the kind of exceptional architecture and finds that have been uncovered. And in that aerial photograph there, you could just see the main excavation area. So the excavations are actually kind of divided into two main areas. We've got the trench here that you've probably seen in a lot of the National Geographic issue and the photographs and whatnot, where we've got all of the beautiful standing architecture and buildings and a lot of the fantastic finds that have come out of there. We've also got Trench T, which has been excavated over the past couple of years as well. And I'm actually looking at both parts of the site, and I'll kind of do a little bit of comparison between those as we go along. So just in a little bit more detail, you can see the main excavation area. This particular building is the one that you might have heard quite a lot about. It's actually Structure 10, quite an exceptional so-called monumental building, 25 metres long by 20 metres wide, 4 metre thick outer walls that are still standing to a height of about 1 metre. Absolutely fantastic place to work. Also very well preserved floor deposits and hearths and things there as well. So as you may be aware, it was featured in National Geographic a few months ago, perhaps on the basis of some of these fantastic finds that we've recovered at the site. Things like this decorated stone, absolutely beautiful painted stone materials as well, beautiful carved stone balls and figurines and things as well. I'm not actually going to talk to you about any of the kind of prettier stuff, shall we say. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the rubbish, the midden deposits at the Ness of Brodgar. So in addition to the really well-preserved architecture, we actually have fantastic preservation of the midden deposits, so the rubbish heaps at the site as well. And I'm quite, as I'm sure as archaeologists, many of you are, quite a fan of rubbish deposits in archaeology, because they can tell us a lot about resource use and activities that are going on within the settlements. And the reason that middens are so important is because they provide kind of this archive for looking at how humans have interacted with the environment and with the landscape. And this project is very much concerned with how people are kind of using resources in the landscape. So this kind of two-way relationship, if you like, how people are actually using resources and having an impact on the environment, but also how the availability of things within the landscape is actually impacting what people can do. And as part of the longer-term aims of this project, we're also hoping to do more comparative work with the rest of Scotland, but also with southern Britain as well, places like Durrington Walls, where we also have quite well-preserved midden deposits as well, thinking about the resources that are available in either northern versus southern Britain and how that influences what people are doing and the sorts of technologies that are developing as well. This particular project that I'm talking about today is particularly focusing on fuel use as a kind of indicator for environmental relationships. So what types of fuels were people actually using? Were people using different types of fuels for different activities? Were different types of fuels perhaps being used at different times of the year or perhaps for different activities? So the first thing that I think we might think of as archaeologists, fuel use in the archaeological record, is wood charcoal. Obviously it's a major source of information when we want to understand what people are burning. But as we also know, there are a lot of taphonomic problems with just studying wood charcoal. Even during its period of use, charcoal is only representing quite a small fraction of what people were burning. It's transformed very readily to ash. So when we're just looking at the charcoal, it's only telling us about a very small fraction. And also we've got the preservation issues with charcoal as well. And in addition to that, and particularly relevant obviously for the Scottish and the Orkney context, is people were burning other things apart from wood. Peat obviously being very important. And other Neolithic sites, kind of in other parts of the world as well, we see animal dung is actually a very important source of fuel. And other sorts of materials, grasses and reeds and things were also used as fuel. So how do we actually approach the study of these types of materials? And that is where my own specialism comes in, kind of microarchaeology, a sort of subset of geoarchaeology, if you like. And it's kind of a catch-all term to describe anything that is invisible to the naked eye, kind of under the microscope, if you like. This integration of microscopic and geochemical methods, and here's just some examples of different types of ash deposits under the microscope. So you've got kind of reeds and grasses here, we've got a wood fuel with some reeds in it as well, and again some reed microfossils there as well. So it's a very powerful tool to look at deposits which appear quite either invisible or quite homogeneous to the naked eye. So the main technique that we've been using up at the Ness of Brodgar is thin section micromorphology. Not a technique that might not be familiar to a lot of you. This is a technique whereby we cut blocks of sediment out of a section and take those back to the lab, set them in resin, and then we can cut a very thin slice from that and turn it into these things, these microscope slides. So you can kind of zoom into the section, if you like, under the microscope to actually look at some of these finely stratified deposits or things which might be difficult to identify by eye. So I always like to describe it as being, it's falling over there, an excavation under the microscope. So it's letting us take our section, if you like, and look at it under the microscope and kind of zoom in. So it's more than just actually looking at things in very high resolution. It's also a very useful linking tool to look at the relationships between different types of material. So thinking back to the example of charcoal, what often happens, obviously, we do sieving, we do flotation. Someone gets the charcoal, someone gets the lithic, someone gets the pottery. It's actually quite important, as you know, to try and bring these materials back together to actually interpret the deposits. And micromorphology is a really good way of doing this, because you can see in this example here, you can see all of these little black deposits, this microcharcoal. You can actually see the relationship between the different classes of materials. It's very powerful in terms of actually determining what type of activity we have. So in terms of fuel, whether it's a domestic fuel deposit, whether it's redeposited, whether it's a so-called kind of industrial type activity related to pottery production or something like that. And alongside the microscopic analysis, I'm just going to briefly mention, it's not something that we started yet, but we've got plans to do this in the future, is to integrate the geochemical analysis as well, using techniques that are kind of developed to identify the origins of things like volcanic ash. We can actually apply these to archaeology as well, to try and get a kind of more detail about where different ash deposits are coming from in terms of fuel types. And just as a comparative example, to kind of show you where this method has been developed, or a lot of this method has been developed, a site that I worked on a number of years ago, another Neolithic site a lot earlier, at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, just to kind of give you the level of information that we can get from this integrated approach. And you can see here is a thin section slide. This is 15 centimetres of stratigraphy, and you can already see the level of detail. And to think back to that idea of actually linking different lines of information, you can see we can look at our charcoal in conjunction with our ash deposits, and in this particular case also look at the embedded clay deposits as well. And this is a really good example of how we can identify pottery production, actual kiln deposits where we don't have things like slags and wasters in the early Neolithic. And this is showing that in this particular case, people were deliberately selecting animal dung as a fuel for this particular activity. And that's quite different to what we see in things like domestic hearths and whatnot at that site. So these are the sorts of methods that we're piloting at the Ness of Brodgar. So we've been working there for a couple of years. I actually collected a huge amount of samples, about 60 samples, which is quite a significant number of large thin sections, in 2013 and 2014. So as I said, we've got samples from the main excavation area in Trench P, but also Trench T, which I'll come back to in a moment. And the idea is to not just kind of look at the site as a whole, but to try to look at spatial variation within the settlement as well. Obviously, it's a very large site. We've got lots of different midden deposits. So it's also a really good opportunity to try and compare what's going on in different parts of the site in terms of different activities that might be going on, and whether they're perhaps linked to different buildings and different activities within buildings as well. So there's the three main midden areas that we're focusing on at the moment. We've got the central midden and two kind of offshoots as well. And what I'm going to do now is just kind of show you lots of what I think are very pretty pictures from under the microscope, just to kind of take you through some of the preliminary observations from the different midden areas and kind of explain the sorts of things that we can see under the microscope. So this is section 246, the central midden area. And this picture that you can see at the bottom here is what I would call a kind of typical midden deposit, if you like. All of this kind of brown ground mass is a very organic, rich material, lots of kind of mineral stuff in there as well. These black deposits that you can see at the top, that's burnt peat residue, which we were kind of expecting. But also we've got a lot of this sort of thing, very small fragments of degraded bone, a lot of which has actually been burnt as well. And this particular deposit is quite interesting because hopefully even as non-micromorphologists you can see that this looks quite different. So the typical midden deposit looks something like that, but we also have episodes with this sort of thing. And what you're looking at here is a ground mass which is much less rich in organic material, is a much lower, if any, abundance of bone and charcoal within that. But we do see a lot of these little white things, these little angular deposits, which are actually sand grains. And what we're looking at there is an episode where we've got a lot of kind of wind-blown sand and exposure of the deposits. And it's quite a thick layer within the midden. And it's suggesting that we've got initially a period where we've got fairly rapid build-up of a dumping of midden material, followed perhaps by a period where that midden's stopped being used for whatever reason. It's been exposed, and that's allowed a lot of kind of wind-blown material to build up in there. Okay, so moving on to one of the other midden areas, section 682. Again, I'm sure this kind of looks a bit like abstract art to most people, but I'll just try and explain what we're looking at here. Hopefully you can see perhaps a little bit of similarity to the other area. We've got a lot of this kind of homogeneous brown, organic, rich material. Again, you can see we've got these little fragments of yellow stuff. That's, again, fragments of burnt bone, or some of it's unburnt as well. And again, a lot of evidence for peat turf burning and whatnot in there as well. This section is quite interesting because we also see a lot of this stuff, which the colour doesn't show particularly well in here, unfortunately. But this appears quite similar to what we've seen at other sites where we've got burning of things like grasses and reeds, and it's melted silica particles. So if you burn grasses and reeds and things at a high temperature, you get all of these kind of tiny silica slag deposits. So something a little bit different perhaps going on there, although we need to look in a bit more detail to actually try and figure out whether it's something like seaweed perhaps as well. And again, we've got a lot of this sort of material here, which is probably peat ash, some sort of ash. Again, we need to do some more geochemistry to actually identify that. And again, the burnt bone fragments that you can see there as well. So similar in some ways, but with some evidence of perhaps something a little bit different going on in some of the deposits as well. This is a very recent observation, so I was kind of going through these slides again. We actually see a lot of phosphate-rich inclusions, including this sort of thing, which looks very much like an omnivore coprolite. And again, we need to do more geochemical analysis to identify that, to see whether it's actually human or some other omnivore, but potentially telling us a bit more about other sorts of activities that might have been going on either in the middens or people dumping that sort of material in there as well. Okay, so just to go to the final part of Trench P, section 714. Again, kind of, I'm not going to go into the kind of the technicalities of the similarities and differences, but you can kind of see, again, we've got this distinctive brown ground mass deposit, kind of mixed mineral and organic material. In this case, we've got ash being very intimately mixed with tiny fragments of bone. And it's unclear at this point whether this either means that people are actually burning bone as a fuel, perhaps, or whether it's some sort of activity where kind of fragments of bone have become mixed, cremation type activities perhaps. As I said, kind of preliminary observations at the moment, and we do need to do a bit more work on that. Also, we see one of our rare fragments of charcoal in this section, and we've got a couple of fragments of charcoal, not in too much abundance at all. This section is also quite interesting. I didn't include a picture of this, but we also have a lot of large fragments of burnt pottery in kind of the middle layers of this particular midden, and we don't have very much bone in those at all. There's a lot of ash. And again, potentially related to maybe pottery production, although this is something that really kind of needs to be integrated with the pottery analysis and the macro-scale archaeology as well. Okay, so just to have a kind of think then, what types of activities and what types of fuels are actually represented in the middens. And obviously, this is very important to integrate this with the macrobotanical analysis, which has been done by Dr. Scott Timpany at UHI. And the interesting thing about our macrobotanical analysis is that despite over 1,000 float samples being analysed, we have an incredibly small recovery of charcoal. And the charcoal that we do have is things like heather and assemblages of weed seeds and other types of seeds and whatnot. They're also indicative of turf burning, so fitting quite well with what we see in the micromorphology. Now, the important and most difficult part, obviously, is actually trying to explain this. Is this scarcity of wood that we see in the Middens due to the fact that wood is scarce in the landscape, or is it because people are deliberately selecting the turf rather than the wood, and why might that be? And it's quite interesting when we think about the pollen records in Orkney, because I think it was kind of a traditional idea that it was a largely deforested landscape in the Neolithic, but a lot of more recent pollen work has shown that this is kind of an oversimplified view, and actually we've got tree stands and whatnot actually preserving into the Bronze Age. So we know that there is wood sources available, but people are not using them as fuel, as we can see so far anyway. So what we are planning to do next, obviously finish the 60 samples that we've collected from Trench P, but also to kind of expand into Trench T, which is, you can just see the early stages of excavation here. This is Scott Pike, who's doing a lot of the geochemical work. And try to get at that kind of spatial comparison. Can we distinguish different midden types and different activities? And Trench T is actually very different in some ways to the main excavation area. It's kind of actually been termed the midden mound because the entire thing appears to be one huge midden deposit. It's at least 3 meters deep and kind of follows, it's further than the trench. Obviously it goes all the way down the slope just off the photograph there. And there's just a picture of part of the section actually from Trench T. And you can see we've got all of these midden deposits slumping down the slope there. So in terms of sampling here, we're also trying to get at the spatial differences within the midden. With Trench P, we've been looking at kind of variations over time within different midden areas. Here we want to try and get a sense of spatial differences. Is this one large kind of monumental event of dumping, if you like, or is it composed of several different episodes of deposition? And obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're also hoping to do a series of geochemical analyses as well. So thin section micromorphology is a very powerful tool, but it's also limited in some ways. There are only certain things that you can actually identify by eye. There's a lot of kind of invisible information that we can get at from the chemistry. And the plan is to do, we've got the subsamples for this, is to do lots of kind of geochemical spot sampling throughout the sections as well, to actually link the microscopic observations with geochemical fingerprinting as well, to see if we can resolve some of these deposits in a bit more detail as well. Obviously, the next stage as well, and I was hoping to be able to talk about this when I kind of proposed the talk, but we haven't had the slides back yet. It's quite a time-consuming process, is to start on the Trench T samples as well. And obviously the most difficult part of all is actually trying to link the microarchaeology with the traditional macroscale analysis, which will be an ongoing process. And I'd just like to thank all of these different funders and supporters of the project, as well as my collaborators, and particularly some of the beautiful aerial photography that you've seen by Hugo Anderson Wymock and his fantastic aerial kite photography. So, thank you.